Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 31. The frontier between the Roman and Bosporan Empire extended from the Outer Sea in the north to the Great Desert in the south, saying nothing of the potential points of conflict across the Inner Sea. However, when you consider that the whole of humanity on either side of this border was being employed in preparation for war, creating a battleground of this unimaginable size was feasible. For years, both sides had known the places where the battles of their eventual clash must be fought. The Romans in particular had established a series of stone-wrought forts that housed several thousand men each, positioned all over Greece, Illyria, and in the final years of peace these had even been added to the wastelands of Gallia. Needless to say, Italia was protected doubly so, with hundreds of thousands of men ensconced in strongpoints. This was economically achievable because they were poorly paid but heavily armed, and under equally heavy duress to serve without possibility of leave until their retirement. The Romans' main weaknesses were that their hinterlands were devoid of human life, and hence not defended in the slightest, but there was no feasible way for the Bosporans to go to these places in force without detection. King Doreius knew most of the details of the Roman disposition, because refugees and defectors came to him every day. Because he had a reputation as a man who settled those who submitted to him fairly, he was able to attract a large amount of talented people, including wealthy families. Most of all, he attracted those whose religious dedication obliged them to make pilgrimage to the Signs of Gold temples, whereupon knowledge that would bring about a forsaking of their old masters could not be ignored. This drain of the Roman people was known to their leader, dictator Pathless. It drove him to redouble his efforts to prepare for his people's so-called repatriation, and was a source of constant embassies insisting that such criminals and spies could not be harboured by another power in peacetime. Since the king had officially decreed that refugees may enter his father's extensive program of citizenship, and were therefore protected peoples like any other citizen, these threats from Rome were illegal provocations. With this, he was able to justify huge increases to the money and resources cities provided to the empire's war treasury, and these resources were spent quickly on two main strands of preparation between 151 and 148 prior. First was the defiant step of reclaiming the city of Segestica from its pall of death. This is a large area of good land in Illyria, which chieftains used to rally their people and establish industries. The Romans had deported and likely enslaved or slain everyone living there in 162 and burned the city to the ground. They did not treat other cities in Illyria like this, but I believe this is because the resources required to actually execute vast numbers of people are considerable, and the late Gaius Caesar had focused his efforts in Gallia and Iberia. At harvest season in 151, King Doreius led a large band of newly sworn citizens to come and cut down all the crops still naturally growing in the abandoned farmlands. For the purposes of storing these crops efficiently, he established warehouses in the ruined city, and of course housing was needed too. After a month, he had clearly begun settling the workers there permanently, generating an explosion of bile from the Romans. They considered the abandoned land their territory, and as I have said, knew that many of the peoples being placed there were defectors and wanted men. Doreius knew of this also, and flaunted it brazenly. He was showing what it meant to be a true king in the face of brutish threats of danger, doing what was not only right for his people, but stepping in to take the risk of doing it even for the people of his would-be enemy. In fact, for the years to follow, the king made his court in Segestica, and even erected a long, voluminous guest house for the endless Roman envoys to make use of. This also had the advantage of keeping travellers to Rome from seeing the second strand of preparation being made in Apollon. This was the training of an army that could suitably contend with the Roman way of war. The Romans preferred to employ infantry in massed ranks, trained mercilessly so that they could carry heavy loads of armour. They would then come forward together and use their tall shields and steel mail to press in close to their foe and chop and stab with short swords. All who witness this kind of fighting agree that it is a terrible thing, with the wounds of such battle being difficult to recover from and visually disgusting in the moment of their infliction, contrasting with the more reasonable effect of arrows or spears. Still, the Romans had proven that this approach was effective in all manner of situations, and had grown to be specialists in this doctrine over centuries of success. Since all this was well known, Doreius ordered that an army of that type be raised. These men were called the Gold Guard, draped in armour even finer than that of Rome, supplied from the east, and trained in the use of great shields and stabbing swords. Moreover, they were trained in the basics of strategy, so that they could understand battles and not be afraid of innocuous things happening around them. Many thousands of these men trained for 2 years at the huge garrison complex of Apollon, where they were also given religious education so that the burning meaning of the task they were training for could be swallowed. Upon completion of their long courses, they were settled in strategic places such as Pannonia and the aforementioned Segestica, so that they would be available for use when the moment of fate came. Also adding to the forces at play was the return of many of the soldiers raised in the Seleucid Wars, who had been gathered together under witness Aeneas at Philippopolis in Thracia. While other generals were in command of these eastern men, the men were wont to follow Aeneas in particular, essentially requiring that he be present on the front line. He did not enjoy this, and made no secret of his desire to return to Persia and attend to ordinary business among ordinary people. However, he was a witness, a rank with similar demands to a king, and so he was not permitted to commit any dereliction of duty, and nor do I think he seriously intended to, since he was well versed in the importance of the example he set, and was a good man plagued by ill humours rather than an ill-humoured man. That brings me to Prince Dion. He was granted leave from the affairs of most of the interwar years because he was committed to a self-made project of religious reverence, or this is how it is generously described. This is the Garden of Yemo's creation in Hierosolyma, a display of hundreds of fine statues that are unusual in their composition, being not of ideal or heroic form, but of ordinary and often despicable build. This is because each piece is infused with the worldly energy of the dead, in the same fashion as the orchard of life that surrounds the city. The source of the beauty is that they are products of understanding of the truth of the world, rather than mere human conceptions of aesthetic interest. That is what everybody says about them. For my part, it is the city of Hierosolyma itself that intrigues me, because even today it remains a model for all cities to follow, and that was established in the time of Dion, contrary to what any student of history would assume. He did an unusually able job of seeing that each part of the city worked to support each other, and in tandem, they all thus did the work of one unit while receiving the support of many, profiting all more than a disharmonious approach can allow. This thought is a topic for specialist tomes. Know only that Dion, for all the criticism he received, put great care into his pet city, and I think his strange way of seeing the world merged with his strange way of speaking to provide designs for social order which were strikingly close to what the tripartite ordains. He remained in close contact with the Ptolemies, and together they did make some preparations for the war with Rome, because the Ptolemies were greedily eyeing Roman possessions in Libya and Carthage. Dion agreed to march with them when the time came, otherwise content to await that time as a patron of arts and wielder of slaves like no other before him. He could not have known when this time would arrive, but able strategists might have judged it to be sooner rather than later, for the Bosporans' advantages would compound over time due to their heightening prosperity. Therefore, it is not unusual that the Romans came up with an excuse to begin the conflict as early as their laws permitted. Here is the scheme they employed to achieve this. Recall that in the days of destitution that followed the fall of Chersonesus, the Bosporan remnant was aided in its return to health by the riverine Heloni, the most mercantile of the steppe folk. This aid had been paid for in turn by granting their descendants superbly profitable trading pacts which now allowed weighty cargoes to be transited across the steppe and the Black Sea. Of course, from there, many items were ferried far and wide across the whole world. Through this trade did the Romans have their own relations with the Heloni, and in the typically Roman style, they conducted these relations through carefully ambiguous legal documents. This, to be brief, permitted the Romans to treat any chance delay of furs or some such benign thing to be evidence of subversion of the Roman state's autonomy and goals. You are doubtless angered even to think of how petty and deceitful they must be, but this was the ordinary approach to business for the leading men of Rome, those that had not had their clans killed off in previous generations by equally pernicious attitudes. Hence the final straw, as it were, was a mere sneezing sailor. This man, the Romans say, was deliberately spreading a steppe sickness in Roman ports by always insisting that any buyers for his goods, furniture, were offering so low a price that he must leave to try the next port. In this way he excused himself to visit as many ports as he could, exposing all he could to his wet-faced, disease-ridden manner. When he tried to trick a wily governor into meeting him to arbitrate a dispute with a buyer, said governor exposed the lies and revealed a conspiracy by the Bosporan alliance to poison the Roman people through these travelling merchants. There is no truth to this, yet, as they said, truth is the first casualty in war. The Roman Senate sent an ultimatum to Segestica, stating that the Heloni were to be holistically rounded up and delivered without fee to a long list of destination ports. Even birds chancing a view through the window were aware that this was an impossible demand, put to ink and tablet for the sole purpose of destroying the order of the world, and in that it was entirely successful. Doreius had no reply be given, as was customary when responding to deeply offensive embassies, and the Romans in turn granted dictator Attalus permission to wage war without any further consultation of the civic bodies. Attalus in turn dispatched riders with the command that war would commence on the first day that the mountains of Altinum were free of snow in the year 148. This mountain pass in the eastern Alps was the shortest route from Italia to Pannonia, and hence the shortest distance between Roman and Bosporan armies. There were perhaps 20 days of rest, in which no legal state of war existed, in which Doreius nonetheless moved as if not only war had been declared, but he had declared it himself. For his plan to address the Roman threat was to cut off the very pass of Altinum that all eyes now watched with hand on hilt. Close to Altinum was the highland city of Noreia. This place could be reached via gentle slopes from the northern side of the mountains, and even had a substantial road the Romans had built that ran straight to Pannonia, the purpose of which had been to approach and exterminate the Silurian peoples of that region as quickly as possible. This made the area easy for the Bosporans to attack, but perilous for the Romans to reinforce until later in the year when the southern approach saw its higher reaches thawed. As such, the king himself went with the Lithosis army to approach from the north. Meanwhile, he mustered his Golden Guard legions in two locations. The first portion was to gather at Bassania, the nubile freedman colony in Pannonia, and then follow his army into the mountains. The second portion was to garrison Segestica, and then advance to cut the road to Altinum and reach the coast. This would break all overland communication from Italia to Illyria, Macedonia and Greece, and make full use of the narrowness of the Romans' grip on that area of the world. After all, if these places could be made to rise up against their masters, which they were utterly desperate to do, the Romans would become like wine flowing backwards into the jug from which it had once poured. To enact this strategy, he appointed Zeusis, son of Dion, to follow him with the first Golden Army, and Phocas, his own son, to command the second. Of the former, we know he was a commander in the vein of his own soldiers, obsessed with discipline and military techniques. It is said he never lied, and no one ever dared to lie to him, which made him a reliable, if overly predictable, general. But he was, of course, primarily there to cement the presence of the Spartacid name in this most decisive of military dramas. Of the latter, Phocas, we know he was an outdoorsman of some repute, albeit with little experience abroad and supposedly weak talent for organising men. He, like his absent elder brother Elpenor, was extremely able when it came to magic and foreseeing the outcomes of material events. For this he was loved by the people he had briefly ruled over, and was a noble credit to his family's reputation. Clearly, Doreius gambled, if he and these two men were at the spear point of the empire, then there would be no limit to the number of people who would follow them into the throes of arduous endeavours. With all forces in motion, the day of the war's declaration came and went uneventfully. No envoys were used to officiate the beginning of the war, because everyone understood the situation was too serious for posturing. The Romans, for their part, were still gathering their army at Altinum, having been slowed down by trailing legions encountering disobedience among subject peoples. Therefore, they had to abandon any plans they might have had of reaching Noreia before Doreius did, precisely as Doreius had hoped. Noreia was abandoned as soon as the king's trajectory had been confirmed. Therefore, the first clashes of the war were not between the main armies, but between the auxiliary force under Aeneas and the garrison of Serdica. This is a city in western Macedonia that had the honour of being mentioned in the earliest Lithosis records. While there is no strict agreement, many will say this city existed before the Golden Age collapse, and revealed to us the presence of land masses in the region prior to the earth-making wars that rose up all the rest to their mountainous heights. The Romans had gone there to plunder crypts and temples for ancient wisdom, and they had indeed found some of their collection in this city. As the Romans closed their border, witness Aeneas was driven to the walls of Serdica by a swell of Odrysians and Thracians who had been preparing armies for this war since the time of Spartacus, some say. Once savage raiders, the Odrysians had stolen so many fine things over their history that they had taken on an attitude of refinement and made for amiable allies to educated Greeks. And their taste for foreign luxuries made them ideal companions for a venture into Roman Macedonia, and indeed Greece itself. Reports say that tens of thousands of them came to Aeneas to join a united front against the enemy, all but forcing Aeneas to provide them with enemy targets, if only to plunder supplies and sustain the horde. As such, armies of many different descriptions moved west along the Danube, settling old grudges and fulfilling old desires. The Bosporan contingent naturally went to Serdica. The Roman army here, under one Publius Vespasianus, had been preparing defences for many years. However, they were forced to come out and fight Aeneas as soon as possible, to avoid the possibility of Odrysian warbands mustering in overwhelming numbers. Killing Aeneas was their firmest bet to reverse the upwelling tide. Vespasianus's plan was simple. They would challenge the Bosporan army from the front with lines of heavy footmen, while a few hundred fast runners bypassed the battle to search for the command staff in the rear. It was known, even to the Romans, that Aeneas was a man with a tight spiritual connection to his warriors, often being called a paragon of high soldiery by those that believe in such kinds of earthly paragons. Therefore, the expectation that his elimination might have a devastating effect on his army, and even if those armies not yet arrived to the war, had basis in true magic. Vespasianus was foiled doubly. Firstly, despite all that knowledge of his target's value, he didn't know that Aeneas, even after the age of 50, trained with a spear daily, and did not possess a horse to ride in battle. Therefore, among the Bosporan formation established on a hillside near Serdica, Aeneas was most likely in the position of honour among his hypaspist shields, an elite company from Philippopolis, that position being the rightmost end of the line, where traditional Greek armies like to place their most experienced men so that they can push back against the rightward drift inherent to right-handed combat. So, among those esteemed men, Aeneas was invisible to his enemy, indistinct save for a ceremonial Persian helmet that he wore during battles because it calmed his outbursts of spiritual possession. Secondly, the men Vespasianus sent to perform the rear attack were held up by a series of strange rope fences that seemed to extend along the Bosporan flanks. These were the work of the small group of Lithosis riders from Aeneas's entourage. They had soaked long stretches of rope in cow's blood and parcelled off nearby areas. This alerted the earth to be wary of these places, and indeed as the Roman troops came upon these boundaries, they were suddenly set upon by stinging insects, slippery mud, and dizzying noises that came from the sky. The noise alerted the Bosporan cavalry to the flanking attempt, and shortly they went and slaughtered the dazed Romans. This calmed the world, and the lines where the Romans had been paralysed are now marked by a mountain of flowering plants with rather superb public markets. I have only visited once, but I forever dream of the wine I had before that wondrous memorial to this victorious day. And a victorious day it was now to be. because the Roman plan had been utterly foiled. The cavalry were now behind them, and the Bosporans began to step forward in front. There was still uncertainty, because no Bosporan had ever clashed with a Roman battle formation. However, this formation was curling around at the flanks, because the Bosporan line was longer. Indeed, Aeneas's company was lunging towards the flank and rear from their exposed position on the end of the line, their fearlessness pushing the Romans away just as effectively as actual arms and legs. Aeneas supposedly begged his soldiers to spare the enemy so loudly that the Romans heard these unusual implorations and took to heart that their foe was not only certain of victory, but had mercy for those already destined to be his victims. They had never met a man like this in their empire, we can be sure of this. In this way, the Romans became completely encircled. Aeneas asked that the Roman commander come to negotiate. Vespasianus revealed himself to be, like Aeneas, hidden among veteran infantry, wearing soldiers' armor. At this, the two sides shared laughter and amazement, and were put at ease by the sight of both of their commanders removing their helmets and placing their infantrymen's spears aside. This was by no means a laughing matter, however, for the Romans had only been more tightly surrounded as the fighting died down, and now they needed to look to Vespasianus for a solution. Aeneas called this man Praetor, which is a Roman word meaning military officer appointed by politicians, and Vespasianus correctly returned with the title of Witness of the King for Aeneas. Vespasianus said that he did not know why war had come, but he had set out with intention to wage it according to his duty. Having been bested, he asked for mercy from a fellow master of soldiers. Aeneas asked if all the Romans present shared the same sense of duty, and the soldiers followed the lead of their praetor in agreeing. Aeneas had kindly allowed them to appear to agree with Vespasianus rather than himself. What happened next is less easy to explain. Aeneas stepped forward, so close to the enemy that his guards were clamoring to bring him back. Then he placed his hand on Vespasianus's shoulder. After exchanging some words of praise, he moved his hand to the man's neck. Suddenly it was the Romans coming forth to save their leader, but there was no apparent danger. Aeneas welcomed them to have their man back, and the two sides stepped back to confer among themselves. After only a few exchanges, Vespasianus leapt forward and knelt on the ground, offering to surrender all the army's weapons in return for being let go with their lives. Aeneas did not reply, because he was taken by a stabbing sickness. Instead, he wrote a message suggesting that the Romans keep their weapons and return to their city as allies of the Bosporan Empire. Vespasianus agreed in a fit of unnatural shouting, then lay still. He was found to have died. Died is not always the word people use, because it is likely that Aeneas's strange properties as a paragonic vessel were at play. Indeed, Vespasianus supposedly completed a part of Aeneas that Ampelios's spirit was yet lacking, and altogether, what had been created here was the final paragon of soldiery. Despite the disagreement on every detail of this, we can at least be sure that Aeneas had at last become a living paragon, if not actually a paragon deity, as others claim. We are sure of this because he took on all the qualities that we know living paragons have today, such as immobility and a mute tongue, changed completely from what he was to instead to be a container of all the good that the three men he merged had done: good intent, good fortune, and good by way of the world. For the Roman onlookers, who were already paranoid about the nature of their foe's magic, this was an outrage that would have broken the moment of peace had their commander not just ordered them to surrender. Since they had love for their commander and wished to see if he could be revived by their medics, they were now obliged to accept Aeneas's hospitality. As promised, they were permitted to leave the field under arms, and so a sizable portion of the Roman army left as would-be allies of the Bosporans, albeit with hardly a crumb of trust to be had between them. Together they entered Serdica and officiated the city's change to a neutral status in the war, under Bosporan guarantee of protection. The Bosporans brought along the fallen, and provided money for them to be treated according to their customs. The Roman soldiers here were of Iberian stock, because Romans liked to move people far from their homes to improve discipline through a sense of hopelessness. They also discovered a poorly maintained temple to Artemis, and made it into their temporary garrison headquarters. There, Aeneas requested that a pit be dug through the ground so as to expose bare earth, and likewise a segment of the roof be removed to reveal the sky. Then he was enthroned at the threshold of the pit, his bare feet hanging over the edge, and he began to write his military treatises by the light from above, shunning any firelight that might have aided him in this. The vast works he authored in these months of scholarship are still being deciphered to this day. Such was the first battle of the war, and its favourable outcome for the Bosporans. Of course, it was of little consequence in a conflict so vast, and next we turn to a battle that had quite the opposite effect. At Altinum, the Roman army had assembled by the summer of 148, and the question of when a decisive battle should be fought plagued the military minds of both sides. The Romans at first presented 20,000 men against the Bosporan 10,000, and that was leaving from our count the 5,000-strong vanguard that had left Altinum before the muster was done in order to block Phocas and his Gold Guard from reaching the coast. There was no engagement, and the Romans built a fort which they occupied for 2 months, awaiting orders. Elsewhere, Prince Dion had been recruited by the Ptolemies to escort an army to Cyrenaica and Libya along the warm southern shores of the Inner Sea. The troops at Serdica had been bolstered by the aforementioned Odrysian horde, and went out to raid the leaderless Roman borderlands, while their own leader carried on his scribe's work. In Hermania, Princes Aristippus and Cineas were scouting the desolate frontier with Gallia, mapping the Roman forts in an attempt to locate a place to attack in force, all the while directing the Hermanian tribes who had joined the coalition of free peoples to flow westwards and make their sacred wars in places that would stymie any Roman push into the Black Forests. All this should only be mentioned in passing, for the final theatre was the critical point of interest. That was King Doreius and Prince Zeuxis' armies at Noreia. Having not made contact with the Romans by the end of a tense summer, they decided to go forward from the mountains and threaten Altinum directly. Seeing this, the Romans finally awoke, and I do not think Doreius knew how forceful this awakening would be. The largest battle of our era, the Battle of Altinum Pass, was nigh. As the full might of the Roman Empire descended upon the king, and he saw that the 20,000 encamped before him was a mere vanguard, we shall quickly understand why this clash for the future of our world later was called the Battle of the New Mountain. For with the approach of the Golden Age, great battles could once again bring great change to mankind and to the world, and no greater battle had there been than this.